Okay, so I am at the site of what had been Bethany Lutheran Church in Greens Creek, Texas. Greens Creek is a community that's a little bit southeast of Giddings, which is the county seat of Lee County. Lee County is a little bit east of Austin and Travis County on Highway 290. Now, Bethany Lutheran Church was established here at this site in 1895 to serve Lutherans who had moved out to this area of the county. Now, there's not much left today. There's a couple of markers here in a cemetery because the actual church was torn down in 1965, about 20 years after it folded in the 1940s. And I do want to relate a kind of interesting story about this church. Again, this Bethany Lutheran Church in Greens Creek, Texas. And I learned about this at the Wendish Heritage Museum in Serbin, Texas last weekend at that. And so to give you some understanding of that story, we're going to go back to 1854 and talk about the Wends a little bit. Now the Wends in late 1854, about 600 of them leave their homeland in what is modern day Eastern Germany, kind of an area called Lusatia around Prussia. And they move to Texas with their pastor, the Reverend John Killian. And they have two reasons that they're doing this. A, they want to preserve their unique culture and heritage. They're a Slavic minority in this area, and they have their own Slavic language. And they also want to preserve their Orthodox Lutheran faith and practice as they see it. Now, to touch on those two things, as far as faith and practice goes, beginning in the late 1700s, about 1797, with Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia, we have what is called the Prussian Union, and it starts out as a voluntary thing where he wants to join the Lutheran and Reformed churches together. And so he starts out with creating a unified liturgy that kind of soft pedals some of the distinct Reformed and Lutheran elements, and that finally comes to fruition in the 1820s. And then a little later he says, okay, we're going to start merging Reformed and Lutheran congregations together, but it's just voluntary, and eventually it becomes a required thing. And this upsets some of the more conservative Lutherans, including Pastor Killian and the Wends. And as a result, that's one of the reasons they come over. Now, jumping back to the culture and heritage, as an ethnic minority in Prussia, their forefathers have been gradually assimilated to the point that there are only a few unique Wendish communities in the area. And at that point in the 1850s, they were experiencing discrimination from the German Prussians in that they're not allowed to speak their Wendish language. The Prussians are trying to Germanize their Wendish Slavic last names. And also, a lot of them are unable to find work with the skilled trades that they know. And even if they can find work, they will have to accept significantly lower pay than equivalent workers that our German heritage will receive. So for these two reasons, in 1854, they decide they are going to come over here to Texas. Only about 90% of them make it. A fair number die of cholera on the way. Some of them die for other reasons. They arrive late in the year, and they make their way here to modern-day Lee County, in the community that's in the southwest portion of Lee County, Serbin, Texas, where the museum I mentioned earlier was. Well, in fairly short order, there are some factions that develop in the congregation, the Wendish Lutheran Church that's set up. It doesn't have an official name at this point, pastored by Killian. And in the 1870s, there is a split. One faction moves basically across the cemetery from the mother church and sets up what is called St. Peter's Lutheran Church, and then the mother church adopts the name St. Paul. So we've got these two competing churches with factions that don't like each other too much across the seminary, which must have been super fantastic. Well, St. Peter's Lutheran Church eventually calls a pastor, and his name is Adi Greif. And I may be butchering this name a little bit because I'm not a native German speaker, so I'm doing the best I can. So Pastor Greif comes, and not long after he becomes pastor of St. Peter's, one of his members, a Wend by the name of Peter Nowak, gets sick. And he's fairly sick, so he calls Pastor Greif to his home, and he tells Pastor Greif, hey, I'm fairly ill. I don't know if I'm going to survive. I'm really concerned. My wife and I, we have 5 children, and I don't know how she's going to be able to take care of these 5 children. The youngest one, as you know, is just a baby, or as Pastor Greif knew. You probably don't know that until I just told you. So Pastor Greif says, hey, my wife and I, we don't have children. we would be willing to adopt your youngest son. And so Peter Nowak agrees to allow Pastor Greif and his wife to adopt that youngest son, whose name is Herman. And a couple of years later, Pastor Greif leaves for another call. I should jump back for a moment. One thing that Peter Nowak asked of Pastor Greif before he adopted his son Herman, he said, "I would like for my son to become a pastor." Well, that does come to fruition. Herman Nowak, who's now Herman Greif, becomes a seminary student. And while he is at the seminary, he meets a fellow who's from Giddings, Texas. And so at this point, we're going to jump back to Lee County here again and get a little more history. Well, so we have the St. Peter's Lutheran Church and the St. Paul Lutheran Church, and we have two factions within those two churches that live down in the Rabs Creek portion, or the Rabs Creek community, which is south of Serbin and south of Giddings. And they feel like it's too far for their children to go all the way to Serbin to school, and it's kind of a challenge for them to come in on Sunday morning because it's the 1870s and travel is not great. We don't have paved roads, we don't have automobiles, certainly can't take a train to Serbin. So they want to set up their own school, and eventually they decide they want to set up their own congregation, and they do. That congregation moves fairly quickly to the community that's now known as Warda, Texas, and that's how we get Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Warda. Well, Holy Cross calls a pastor, his name is, and again I'm probably butchering this to a certain extent, Pastor Buchshaker. Now, Pastor Buchshaker is very interested in establishing little congregations to serve some of the communities that have sprouted up in the area. And so he first establishes one in Giddings, Texas. That's Immanuel Lutheran Church in Giddings around 1871, within months of his call as pastor to Holy Cross and Warda. Once that congregation becomes pretty solid in the 1890s, he starts his work down here in Greens Creek at what becomes Bethany Lutheran Church. In 1895, after Bethany Lutheran Church here in Greens Creek is established, they call their first pastor. Well, the first pastor of Bethany Lutheran Church is none other than Herman Nowak Greif, who had been born in this area, was adopted by Pastor Greif, and then left the area. So jumping back to the seminary, Pastor Greif, at that point, seminarian Greif, he has a friend who's from Giddings, Texas. His friend says, this guy, you look a lot like a guy by the name of Gustav Nowak that I know. That happened to be Herman Greif's older brother. And so in 1892, or somewhere thereabouts, we think, Herman Nowak Greif is reunited with his family, who've now moved to the east to Round Top, Texas. And then about 3 years later, he becomes pastor of a church of Wendish heritage here in Lee County, close to where he was born and where his family had lived. Well, Bethany Lutheran Church was always kind of a struggling parish. For a while, about every 2 years, they would go through pastors. They were joined with another new congregation in what's called Mecklenburg Settlement, a little bit north of LaGrange, Texas. And they continued that arrangement for some time. Eventually, in I think 1914, if I recall correctly, they call their final full-time pastor Reverend Fedor Killian, who is actually the grandson of John Killian, who came over with the Wends in 1854. He serves until 1925 when he dies, and like I said, he was their last full-time pastor. And then for the next about 20 years, until the congregation is discontinued, they're just served by pastors from neighboring parishes. And then in the late 1960s, I think 1967, the building here was demolished. And like I said, the marker over there does have a picture of the building. I'll post that to my Instagram feed so you can see what it looks like. And that's all for this time. Thanks for joining in. Have a good day.